Welcome back. Today we're going to explore the magnificent concept of key squares, or critical squares. Those are squares that your king must occupy to guarantee the safe passage of your pawn. Now, let's figure out, how do we figure out the key squares? Well, start with the pawn and go up 2 squares and make a little T. It's those 3 squares above the pawn. Now, if your king can get to any one of those 3, if the only things on the board are the 2 kings and 1 pawn, you should be able to win. If you play properly, it's an absolutely guaranteed win. As the pawn moves up the board, so do the key squares. So you have to be careful about pushing the pawn before your king has the ability to get to a key square. Now, here the pawn is on the 4th rank. When it goes to the 5th rank, the key squares are going to stay on rank 6, and they're going to double. If your king can get to any of those 6 squares, you should have a win. And you'll notice, going back to our fundamental positions, fundamental position number 3, the king would have been over here on d7 or on f7. Fundamental position number 4, the king would have been on e6. So the reason those fundamental positions work is because those are key squares. Okay, let's take a look at this position here. This position. White wants to promote the pawn. The black king wants to stop the pawn from promotion. Step 1, identify the key squares. Now, the fascinating thing about key square ideas are that the fight is over the key squares. The fight is not over the pawn. The fight is over the key squares. If you can get the key squares, you win. If your opponent can stop you from getting the key squares, you don't win. So how does white get the key squares here? Well, do not play the king to c5. Black will go to c7 and take the opposition. You'll never get a key square. The correct move, take the diagonal opposition, then the direct opposition, and then you can outflank and advance your pawn as you like. Or you can play it this way. Let's look at that again. We outflank, and now we get in front. We outflank again, and the pawn can protect itself. You can just walk right in. Okay, let's back up to this position and bring the pawn up. Now we have our fundamental position number 4, and we can win it this way as well. I think you recognize these moves. We advance without check and guard the promotion square, and there's your queen. Okay, let's look at this one. Come on. This one is a little trickier, isn't it? Look at where the key squares are. Both kings are far away. How is white going to play this? Well, it's an easy mistake to make, to go over to the f-file and then run straight up the f-file. That will not work, however, because the black king is closer to the key square on f6 than the white king. But the white king has an advantage with the key square over on h5. So we're going to go for the distant key square. White now has a problem, but it's not much of one. Black has taken the opposition. However, white does the equivalent of outflanking. White wants to get to h6, which is a key square. The only way black can stop that is by going to g7, but that allows white to take the opposition and outflank and walk in. Okay, now this gets a little tricky here, but it's okay because we're advancing with check each time. And white has the new queen. So this position, you aim for the outside key square. Here, black wants to promote the pawn. White wants to stop the pawn. Black has one really good move, and everything else is really bad. What is the one really good move here? Well, let's see. If you move the king to d5, what will white do? White will go to d1, taking the distant opposition, and you won't get a key square. But if you go to f5, white tries to hit up, but black now takes the diagonal opposition, which turns to direct opposition, which allows you to outflank and bring up the pawn and win. Okay, I think we can see where this is going. Yes. All right. Let's take a look at a whole different situation. We've been looking at key squares for the pawns that are on the B file through the G file. The A file pawn and the H file pawn have totally different key squares. And here's why. Let's say black can get in the corner. White can't get the king out of the corner. That king can stay there until you get a stalemate. Now, you could have fooled around a little bit. Let's say black has an extra move. Black just stays in the corner as much as possible. Now, what is white going to do? Stalemate. Once the king is in the corner, you cannot get it out. Now, what happens if the white king is in the corner? The black king can keep it in the corner. The white king cannot get out. Stalemate. So now we see that for A pawns and H pawns, you cannot allow either king in the corner. And that tells us what the key squares are. So now we see that we cannot allow either king in the corner, and that means the key squares are down here on B8 and B7. Here, white to move. White wants the king on a key square. Just go right for it. There you are. Once you've got the key squares, if black cannot capture the pawn on the way down, your pawn is going to be safe. Okay, this position. Here it's black's turn to move. What are the key squares for the black pawn? Well, the key squares are on G1 and G2. So black has to keep the white king off of those squares. Take the opposition. Don't let the king even get close. Take the opposition. Take the opposition. And now there's no way white can get in to stop the black pawn. These key squares really matter. Let's say we have the same position, but it's white's turn to move. White just makes a beeline for those key squares. And black will never get a key square, and black will not be able to win. The white king got in the corner. When you're dealing with H pawns and A pawns, remember, the key squares are very different from all other pawns. You have to occupy a key square or at least keep your opponent from getting anywhere near them. Okay, one other set of key squares, and that is when you have blocked pawns. Two pawns that are in the way of each other. The key squares are found 3 squares out to the side of the opposing pawn. So in this position here, white's key squares are A6, B6, C6, E6, F6, and G6. If white can get to any one of those 6, white should be able to win. So let's see this in practice. First, we're going to aim for the key squares. Black comes up. Now be careful. Remember what we've talked about with opposition and outflanking. If you go straight up, if you go to F5, Black will play to f7, take the opposition, and you will not get a key square. The correct answer is diagonal opposition, which becomes direct opposition, which allows you to outflank, which allows you to move in towards the pawn, and we have opposition again, and outflanking again, and opposition again, and capturing the pawn, and what do we have? Fundamental position number 4, white wins. Okay, let's look at another one. In this position, the key squares are here with the green circles. White to move. What should white do? By now you should be very familiar with this. What is the right move here? I hope you chose diagonal opposition. Direct opposition. Outflank and you're on a key square. Okay, let's look at another one. This time it's black's turn to move. Now, black actually has a way to not lose this game. If it were white's turn to move, white would push the pawn. It's a little tricky. Black's turn to move. Black pushes the pawn, and now black doesn't care if white has the opposition. Black doesn't care if white has the key squares, because when you're this far back, when you capture that pawn, now there's a new set of key squares. Now it's key squares for an isolated pawn. Now the key squares are on e6, f6, and g6, and black has the opposition. White will not be able to promote the pawn if black plays properly. Let's test this out. Black gets in front because white cannot take the opposition. What should black do here? Go straight back. We're aiming for fundamental position number 1 with it being white to move. So don't go down to e8 or g8. Now you can do that. Now you go to e8. Advance with check, and the game is a wreck. Okay. This position is really interesting. We have blocked pawns, but we also have an extra pawn. But the key feature is the blocked pawns. We want the key squares for the blocked pawns. First step, I know it seems a little strange because you usually want to head right towards something, but quite often the direct path is the wrong path. We want the very distant opposition first. That becomes distant opposition, which becomes direct opposition. And now comes a question. Can we get to the key squares on the king side? Probably not. Instead, white shifts gears and aims for the key squares on the queen side of the board. It's a little bit of a walk, but the other person only has a king too. And look what we're doing. Opposition, outflanking, opposition, outflanking, and we're on a key square. Opposition, capture the pawn, and this should be a very easy win under any circumstances. Okay, so those are some of the ideas of key squares for blocked pawns. And here's another one. White, let's slow this down. White advances the king. Black takes the diagonal opposition. White doesn't care because the key feature here is the blocked pawns. White says, go ahead, take me. Black does, of course. But now white is on a key square for the blocked pawns. It's really important to be able to see the hidden possibilities in these positions. Many people would take a look at that extra passed pawn and try to figure out a way to get it through. And there might be a way, I don't know. But the important thing is when you see a winning path, just go for it. Opposition, outflank, opposition, outflank, opposition, outflank, capture. And here we have fundamental position number 4, and white should win this. Okay, let's take a look at this position. White to move. What's white's only good move? What is the only good move here? Grab the key square. Okay, let's look at this one. This is white's turn to move. What's the only good move? Take the opposition. Now we got a tricky one. This one is really tricky. It's white's turn to move. White has 2 possible pawn moves. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 possible king moves. Only one of them is any good. And it's a strange one. If you go up the board, if you move the king here, for example, black is going to say, take me. And then you will have an A pawn, and the black king will get to the corner before the white king can stop it. So that's not going to work. If you move the pawn straight up to b4, then that's not going to work either, because black will simply capture the pawn en passant, and the game is a dead draw. The correct move is a very strange looking one. We're going to come down behind the pawn. Okay. If you take the pawn, do you have any chance of winning this? No. The black king will get in the corner and you'll never get out. Okay, so what happens if we move the pawn to b4? Well, that suddenly throws the key squares way up to the 6th rank. So let's just move the pawn up 1 square. The black king moves in. Now we have to go kill that pawn, which we do. Black takes the opposition on the diagonal, but it doesn't help because white is aiming for the key square on a5. Black blocks that, but allows white to take the opposition and outflank, and we have another one of our winning positions. Here's another really fantastic opportunity to use the blocked pawns. First, let's give us blocked pawns. King moves away. Surprise move. If black captures, you capture back. You've got you've got the king on its way to the key square on h5. That's an easy win. Black doesn't do that. Now, here's where simple counting comes in handy. If you move the king to d2, black can come down to f3. Let's see, that's one move, another move to capture your pawn, another move to step to the side, and 3 more moves to promote the pawn. That's 7 moves. How many moves will it take the white pawn to promote? The white pawn at f4. 4 moves. White can afford to let black come in and take the pawn because white will promote first. Now, it's still a little bit tricky, but this should be a win. And in a later lesson, we're going to be exploring the idea of how does a queen fight against a pawn on the 7th rank, or in this case, the 2nd rank, rank 2. Let's play this out. First, the pawn cannot possibly promote if the king is in check. King has to move away. Let's check the king again. Now, the king wants to get his pawn in, but black says, I want a queen, and white says, well, you're going to have to step on your king to get there. The king has only one move. It must block the pawn. Now, here again, the reason I did all those stalemates in the beginning is we want to make sure we avoid stalemate. The correct move is not to bring your king closer on e2, but to go to e3. Black has only one move, and that walks right into a checkmate. Not a good ending for black. But the key was creating the blocked pawns. Let's look at this one. Okay. White wants to win this. Black doesn't want to let white get to a key square. Can white do it? Let's try doing this in your head for a moment. Just take a second and figure out the moves. White moves first. Will white be able to get to a key square? Okay, here we go. Diagonal opposition, direct opposition, outflank, and you've got a key square. I know we've gone over this same pattern several times, but as a friend of mine says, repetition is the mother of retention. The more you see these, the more likely you're able to find them in your own games. Final position. How does black avoid losing this game? White is about to walk over and take that pawn, be on a key square. It'll be easy. But it's black's turn. Black has a very clever move. Black says, take me. If white obliges, what does black do now? Remember, this is all about opposition. Black takes the distant opposition, keeps the distant opposition until it can turn into direct opposition, and the key squares for this pawn are c6, e6, and d6, and black has the opposition. White will not get through. So we use all of these ideas that we've been talking about, and they're all interlocked. Opposition, outflanking, key squares, the square of the pawn. These are going to show up in your games all the time. The more familiar you are with these ideas, the more likely you are to win and avoid losing. Okay, next lesson, we're going to be talking about passed pawns and protected passed pawns, and that will be a relatively short video, but a very important one. Okay, look forward to seeing you then. Welcome back. Today we're going to explore the question of the outside passed pawn and the protected passed pawn. Okay, I mentioned earlier that a passed pawn is simply a pawn that no opposing pawn can stop, so therefore the opponent must bring pieces in to stop that pawn. An outside passed pawn is a passed pawn that's far away from the main body of pawns. So here you can see clearly white has a passed pawn over on the b file, and the main body of pawns is over on the king side. White has a very simple way to win this. The white pawn on b5 is going to distract the black king, and that will leave white freedom to go over and wipe out all the pawns on the king side. So first we move our pawn over. Why won't it move? There we go. We move our king over. The king backs up, and now we go after the pawns. What is black going to do? Well, taking the opposition does absolutely no good. White will still walk over and kill the pawns. So black figures the best idea is to at least take care of that one. But you can see that there is no way black should be able to survive this. White has two passed pawns over on the king side, a strong king position. This is an easy, easy win. Now, it's not always quite so easy. Here's a slightly more complicated position. Both sides have an outside passed pawn, but the white pawn is further outside. Generally speaking, the further outside pawn has the advantage. So white is going to simply use the a pawn to distract the black king, capture the pawn, and then walk over and take the black pawns. Now this time it's not quite as simple because black gets there in time. to at least take one pawn. But that's not good enough. The farther outside passed pawn was good enough to win fairly easily here. Okay, let's look at another. This one is a bit trickier. White cannot just simply abandon the pawn and go over and try to catch the black pawn, because watch what happens if white just starts out immediately. Black captures the pawn and then follows the king. We just follow the king and lock him on the edge of the board. White will not be able to get off the edge without letting black into the edge. Black gets in the corner and it doesn't work. So the correct way to play this is make the king spend an extra tempo. Tempo is Latin for time. In chess, we use tempo to mean a move. We're going to make black waste a move. We guard the pawn. King has to move back, move up, and now the black king is one square further away from the pawn than it was a moment ago. It's going to take black 2 moves to take the pawn, not just 1. And that is all white needed. Okay, what are the key squares for this pawn? B7 and B8. White immediately aims for the key squares, and that's a win. Now, there's one other little complication here. You might think, well, if chasing the king back once was good, would it be better to chase it back even further? Well, the answer is no, surprisingly, because if you move the king back one more, oops, we'll make him back up even further. But now watch what happens when we go after the pawn. Look at the black king. It's got a straight diagonal down to c8. That's going to block white from getting the key squares for the A pawn. We simply keep running down, and white will not get a key square. And the game will be a draw. So the trick in this position is to take into account what the key squares are going to be once you've eliminated that black pawn on A5. And if you can do that kind of calculation in your head, you're going to go a long way in the game of chess. Okay, so that's a bit about the outside passed pawn. Let's look at a protected passed pawn. Now, we've seen a little bit of this before. A protected passed pawn is simply a passed pawn that is protected by a pawn behind it. In this case, white's g5 pawn is protected by the pawn on h4. And that means that the black king is stuck in the square of the g5 pawn. It cannot leave the square of the g5 pawn. And white immediately puts the stress on the king. Black takes the opposition and he's still in the square, but now white has a little spare move, and we're going to be talking about spare moves later, right here. What is black to do? Well, there are no good moves. If he backs up, white goes after the pawns. Captures, and comes after the pawn. The black king stays in the square of the other pawn, and now white comes after the protection of the pawns. Black's turn. What does black do? Diagonal opposition, direct opposition. Remember something that we mentioned earlier. Opposition is only good if you can keep it. And here, white is going to walk black off of the opposition. Black cannot keep the opposition. f6 is guarded by the pawn. Black backs up. Now remember what we said about keeping the opposition. White won't be able to keep the opposition either if white takes it right now. So white outflanks. what is black going to do? Well, if black takes the opposition, you simply push the pawn in and this should be an easy win. So the protected passed pawn was quite the winner there. Here's another protected passed pawn, and again, it has to do with the square of the protected passed pawn. The black king cannot leave the square of the white pawn on a5. Black has taken the opposition, denying white the chance to capture the black pawn, but remember the square of the white pawn on a5. The black king is in the square, but it cannot leave that square. Here's the square. Black backs up, white takes the diagonal opposition, the direct opposition, outflanks, and now white is going to be able to capture the pawn. Opposition, capture the pawn. And again, an easy win from here. So that's a little bit about the outside passed pawn and the protected passed pawn. They're very important tools to have in your arsenal. So thank you. I hope you enjoyed this. And next we're going to be looking at a pawn race and spare moves. Okay, I'll see you then. Thank you. Okay, welcome back. Today it's going to be a day at the races. We're going to have pawn races, and then we're going to look at the concept called spare moves. So let's take a look at this position here. Both pawns want to race down and become a queen. Black has the advantage of the being a more advanced pawn, and it's also black's turn. So it looks like black is going to win this race. Let's take a look. It's really straightforward. Both pawns just simply run up the board. And as we can see, black gets there first, but white is about to promote, and the white king isn't close enough to try to guard that pawn. But white now has a problem because it's black's turn, and all black has to do is attack the promotion square and then occupy the promotion square with the queen, and there's no way that pawn is going to get in. Black simply brings the king over, and capture the pawn. And this should be a very, very easy win from here. So this pawn race was really not fair. Black had a head start. Let's look at this position. Here again, it's going to be a race, but this time they're starting out equally. But it is black to move first. So black will get the queen first, then white. And you might think the game would be a draw, except for one very important thing. There are tactics in the endgames. Look at the position of the white king. It's on the same diagonal that the white pawn is going to promote on. So let's see how this race turns out. Both sides head for their promotion squares. Both sides get a queen. But now white has a problem, because black can skewer the white queen. King has to move out of the way, and there she goes. So there are little tricks like this frequently at the end of a pawn race. Let's look at another one. Look at the position of the two kings. This is the opposition, remember? Both kings are blocking the king from moving towards the other. Again, we're starting with black to move. And this time, the race is going to be something where both sides get a queen, but because of the location of the white king, the white queen will be lost. Black plays the queen to g1, checking the king. Because of the opposition, the white king has to go to the h file, where it can be hit with the queen, skewering the white queen again. Okay. So there are a lot of little tricks in these pawn races. Here's another. This time it's white's turn to move first. But again, look at the location of that white king. It's on the same diagonal as the new queen. So this check, again, skewers the queen. Let's see. Okay, this time we have white to move. And again, the pawn race is fairly straightforward. Both sides are just going to move their pawns. But what happens here at the end? White moves, black pushes, white pushes, black pushes, white pushes, black pushes. And this time it's the black king that's in the unfortunate position for a skewer. Check, king moves out of the way, and there will be no black queen in this position. Okay, in this pawn race, the black pawn is clearly got a little bit of a problem because the white king is in the square. The black king, well, would like to be able to find a way to stop the white pawn, but let's see what happens if it's just a straightforward pawn race. First, we have to get out of the way of the pawn, and then they start running. Now there's a big problem here. The white king gets in the square of the black pawn, and the black king is nowhere near the square of the white pawn. So black's strategy of making it a race just was not a good idea. The correct idea is to take the opposition on the white king, and then when white goes down to capture the black pawn, black will move in to capture the white pawn. So white sees that happening, and so white pushes the king one more time. Now, there's a very interesting thing here. If we have a pawn race now, look where the white pawn is going to promote. It will put the black king in check, and that will give white the extra tempo to go over and capture the black pawn. So black continues. And now, let's look at this for a moment. If black were to try to race now, again, white would get the queen first, then black, but then look at the position of the black king. It's on the same diagonal as the new black queen. White would zip over to h8 and skewer the queen with the same tricks that we saw earlier. So black stops that, and now white begins the race. And black says, okay, I'm going to get in front of your pawn. And white says, no, you're not. In fact, I'm threatening to go get your pawn. Now the pawn race is on. But again, look at where the black king is. When white promotes, it's going to be check. The king has to move away. White simply goes over to a8 and captures the pawn in the next move. So there are all sorts of clever little tricks in these pawn races. Let's look at one more. Actually, we're going to look at a couple more. I love this one. The black pawn threatens to advance with check, and that's going to waste a move for white. White will have to move to get out of the way. So white comes up with a clever plan. White decides to go after the black pawn. That means the black pawn won't be able to advance. Black will have to move the king up. White does the same trick again. Black has to bring the king up. Now white begins the pawn race. Let's go. Black has the check, but now white has a very clever move. Having induced the black king to go all the way up to the 4th rank, white now comes back down and is threatening to go to c2 and then to b1. That means black cannot push the pawn again. And meanwhile, the black king is hopelessly outside the square of the white pawn. So black must not move the pawn now. Black must bring the king down to combat the white king. And now the pawn race goes again. And now white has the final trick. Come after the pawn. Pawn cannot promote because it's not protected. For the pawn to be protected, the king must come to a2, which puts it in line for a check. And now checkmate is going to follow. King runs down, checkmate. What if the king had decided to go up? Maybe it goes up here. Well, that's no good either, because this is also checkmate. So these pawn races can be very exciting and loaded with tactical tricks. It's one of the things to really look out for and to plan for, in fact. Okay, so that's our little excursion into pawn races. Let's take a look at spare moves. What's a spare move? Well, a spare move is when you have moves to make and your opponent doesn't, and your opponent needs them. Let's look at this position here. Black is perfectly happy with this position. If black could just stay like this and say, I pass, I pass, I pass, I'm not going to make a move, I like where I am, black would be very happy. But it just doesn't work that way. White wants the king to get out of the way, so white can attack the lead pawn on f5. To do that, white takes advantage of the fact that white has two spare moves with the h-pawn. He cashes in one immediately. Black moves away. White moves in to capture the pawn. Black comes back to guard it, but now white cashes in the second spare move. Where are you going to go, Mr. King? Well, it doesn't much matter, because now white gets the pawn. Black has to continue guarding it, and white now improves the position of the pawns. And now white says, okay, I've got 3 pawns, you've only got 2. Time to trade down. Okay, remember when we talked about the outside passed pawn? White has an outside passed pawn. It's not very far outside, but in this case it doesn't have to be. White simply sacrifices the h-pawn to go after the poor little pawn on f6 and take the opposition, keep the king out, and what do we have? Fundamental position number 3, and a very easy win. There's nothing to it. You just walk in and get a new queen. So that was our first little excursion into spare moves. Let's look at another one here. Okay, it's black's turn to move, and look at the pawns on the queen side. Black's pawns have not moved, which means they have more choices. White has moved one of the pawns, and that cuts down on some of the choices white will have. First, black goes after the white pawn. White must protect the pawn. And now, remember that idea that one pawn stops 2? Here's where black cashes in on that idea. a5. White has 1 spare move with the b-pawn. Black has 1 spare move with the b-pawn. White goes first. Black uses the last of his spare moves. And white is stuck. White has to abandon the pawn. And this should be an easy win. We simply push the pawn down, take the opposition, go after the remaining pawn on h4, and this should be easy to win. Spare moves 1. Okay, let's look at another spare move problem. Sometimes you actually want your opponent to have a spare move. Interesting position. White does a little pseudo stalemate of the black king, but it's not stalemate because black has a pawn to move. And white advances the pawn all the way up to h4, and black has a move. White wanted black to have a spare move so that white could step out of the way. The black king has to get off the promotion square. White guards the promotion square and gets the new queen. So this is a case where you want your opponent to have a spare move. Final position for the spare moves. Here, it's black's turn to move, and black does another one of those pseudo stalemates. It's not really a stalemate because white has a move. White has to move the pawn. Black captures, and now white has all these spare moves with that A pawn. The pawn moves up, the black pawn comes down, the pawn moves up, pawn moves down. This pawn race is not going to look good for white, because when black promotes, it's checkmate. Again, it's the spare moves. Sometimes you want to make sure you have the extra spare moves. Sometimes you're really happy with your opponent having a few spare moves. So that's our little excursion into pawn races and spare moves. Next up is a really surprising idea, a shocking idea actually. It's called a diagonal march. And it's going to be quite amusing, especially that very first position that we look at. So I look forward to seeing you there. Thank you. Okay, welcome back. Today we're going to explore this bizarre idea called the diagonal march. Let's take a look at this king here on d1. How many ways can it get to d8 in just and exactly 7 moves? Well, don't bother counting. There are 393 different ways the king can get from d1 to d8 in exactly 7 moves. Let's take a look at this next. That's an absolute jumble in a madhouse. But it shows you the different ways that the king could possibly go. The king can make it as far away as the G file or as far away as the A file and still make it back to d8 in 7 moves. That has the bizarre implication that a king can move in 2 directions at once. As it is going from d1 to e2, it's approaching the G file and the H file. And at the same time, it's no closer to the 8th rank than it would have been if it had gone to d2. And the same thing if we go up to f3. Now it's closer again to G and H, but it's just as close to the 8th rank as if it had gone up to d3. Now, this position here is one of the wildest positions in all of chess. The black king is clearly inside the square of the white pawn. The white king is clearly way outside the square of the black pawn. At first blush, you think, well, okay, black wins this easily. But in fact, the game is a draw properly played because the white king is going to go in 2 directions at once. It's going to head towards the white pawn at the same time it's coming towards the black pawn by going on the diagonal. If black runs, white continues on the diagonal. If black continues to run, white shifts gears and goes straight for its pawn. Black runs, white says, I want a queen too. If the black king comes up to stop it, the white king is just exactly close enough to guard the pawn and the promotion square. The game will be a draw. Okay, let's look at another idea. What if instead of racing the pawn, black says, okay, I'm going to take yours. White says, fine, I'm still coming in my diagonal and coming towards both pawns. If black captures the white pawn, white will be able to get in the square of the black pawn. If black runs, white continues on the diagonal. If black captures the white pawn, white will be able to get in the square of the black pawn by simply going down to f4. Like this. And white will capture the black pawn. If, on the other hand, black runs, white will get back to protect the pawn. Black runs, white advances, black threatens the pawn, white guards the promotion square, and both sides promote again. It's an absolutely insane position that white can actually get a draw here. Let's look at the main line again. King comes out on the diagonal, pawn runs. King comes out on the diagonal, pawn runs. King comes over to protect its own pawn. Pawn runs. Pawn goes to promote. King tries to stop it. White says, no, I'm going to do it. Black gets a queen, white gets a queen. The game will be a draw. Absolutely amazing position. This is a game that was played many, many years ago. And white misplayed it. White did not understand that idea of the diagonal march. White went straight over to capture the black pawn. But watch what the black king does. On every move, the black king will make progress going up the files, or up the ranks rather. Up to rank 4, up to rank 5, up to rank 6, up to rank 7, and white will not get a key square. However, white should have won this by using the diagonal march. Make black waste one move going sideways. Here's how it works. King comes up to block again. The king just lost a move. It went sideways. Now when white comes down, white gets to a key square and will promote. What if, back in this position, black had not gone over to d3, but had gone up to b4? Well, again, the black king is going to have to go sideways, waste one move. The diagonal march lets white win this. So the trick in these positions is to see how you can use the diagonals to go in two directions at once. White properly plays this by coming out to deflect the black king, at the same time making as many moves towards the white pawn as it would have had it gone in a straight line. This position is really interesting. The black pawn looks like it's miles away from the white king. White has the use of the diagonals to end up getting a draw out of this. First, come down towards its own pawn, and now look at what white is threatening. White is threatening to move the king to b7. And that would allow the pawn to walk in, because white would then have fundamental position number 3. So black has to stop that, but now look at what white has done. White just took 2 moves, and on the 3rd move gets in the square of the black pawn. And of course, black will now be able to take capture the white pawn. So in this position, strangely enough, white can get a draw by utilizing the diagonals. Here's another really interesting one. It's white's turn to move, and it looks as if black just simply walks over, kills the white pawn, and marches in. But if white plays this properly and uses the diagonals, coming in behind the black king, notice on every move, white is making progress down the board. And I think we can see the right move here. Don't let black have the key squares. And the game will be a draw. Now, what would have happened if white had come straight down the board, not using the diagonals? Now, black pushes, and white had to waste time going sideways. Black gets a key square and walks in. So the key in these positions is to recognize how you can use the diagonals. One more really fantastic diagonal idea. The white king is terribly outside the square of the black pawn, and white is about to lose the pawn on a4. But white has an interesting idea. White comes in on the diagonal, threatening to protect its own pawn, while coming just as close to the f-pawn as if it had come straight towards it. And this move is the killer. What is black to do? Black has to capture it because otherwise white advances with protection from the king. But now look at the white king. It gets in the square of the black pawn. And the black pawn will not make it. Absolutely amazing position. White simply uses the diagonal to get close to the square of the black pawn. Okay, so that is our excursion into the diagonal march. It's an absolutely amazing use of the geometry of the chessboard. So I look forward to showing you the next section, which is going to be on triangulation, which is another really powerful weapon to have in your tool chest. So until next time, thank you, and I will see you for triangulation.